The subtitle for our 5th annual predictions report sums it up. The outlook is for a turbulent world. 2019 saw a variety of challenges facing the resilience community. Whether it's cyber threats, extreme weather events, geopolitical upheaval, or one of a dozen other global risks, we're heading into 2020 with no shortage of issues to tackle in the new decade. Some of them are already on our doorstep, as we'll learn from today's speakers. I'm Chloe Domorowski, President and CEO of DRI International. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our first webinar of the new year. We will be featuring the findings of our annual Resilience Trends and Predictions reports as compiled by the Future Vision Committee. Today, we'll hear from some members of the committee. Lyndon Bird, Chief Knowledge Officer and Future Vision Committee Chair, will give an overview of the reports and what they mean for resilience professionals. David Porter, Director of Business Continuity Management at the Australian Taxation Office, will provide a first-hand account of a high-profile extreme weather event, the Australian bushfires. And Boris Issavi, Director of the Business Continuity Management Program for Gilead Sciences, will focus on technology risks, including the recent ransomware attack on Travelex. If you haven't already, you can download the Trends and Predictions reports from our library. Visit drii.org and select Explore Resources to visit the library and access these and other materials. Highlights from the reports can also be seen on our news page, Drive. Check out drive.drii.org for more information. If you have questions for the committee, you can submit them during the presentation. Our speakers will answer them in Drive when the presentation is made available on the DRI website. We'll start the presentation with Lyndon. Thanks for taking the time with us today.
Hi there, I'm Lyndon Bird, and I'm chairman of the Future Vision Committee. For those of you who are not familiar with the Future Vision Committee, just like to run through a few background items. Firstly, our committee was set up 5 years ago, and the aim of the committee, which I think we have largely achieved, is to create a leading global think tank on matters of organization resilience and to help develop the resilience discipline as a respected business profession. And our members to do that across the world. We have members in the US, in Europe, Australia, Asia, and the Middle East. And you can probably tell from my accent, I'm from the UK. Each year we do a number of standard publications. The two key ones, and this is what we're talking about today, are the annual Global Risk and Resilience Trends Report, which we follow shortly afterwards with the annual Predictions Report. But in addition to that, we also look at resilience as a career. We produce periodic reports and updates about how we see resilience is changing, how the career professionals are changing, what their roles and responsibilities are. We cover a little bit of this also in the Trends Report. And then, as necessary, for key issues that are emerging around the world, we often will put together ad hoc white papers, which the DRA will publish at appropriate times. So these are the key publications that we get from the Future Vision Committee. I'd like then really talk a little bit about this year's Trends Report, just to give you a flavor before we get into any detail. Well, asking all the resilience professionals in our survey what really keeps them awake at night and what makes them worry, we identified the top 5. The top 5 concerns and issues that the resilience professionals are reporting this year are, firstly, the vulnerability of their organizations to a major cyber attack. Secondly, the consequences of a severe data breach. Thirdly, a more traditional one, general IT outages, typically due to human error, technical faults, not a direct attack, just simply the nature of running a complex technology environment. Fourthly, extreme natural disasters, which is an area that, of course, we've considered as a very serious issue for many years. And then surprisingly, number 5 this year came up with concerns about management failure in a crisis situation. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation, but it was a surprise to the committee that this particular issue came up so high in the ratings. The format for the report follows the same pattern each year, and essentially we start off by trying to identify what are the key risk and resilience concerns and issues for the year in question. We boil this down to about, well, in fact, to actually 20 items, which we then put out to survey for the DRI certificate holders to give their opinions on. Having got the survey information back, we rank this in probability of these type of issues occurring, the impact should they occur, and we combine them into a resilience index. We do a lot more detailed analysis of the survey findings. We do a cut across regions, a cut across sectors. So we look at how different regions will view the importance of particular issues and how consistent these issues are across different sectors. We also look to some extent about how the resilience professional's role is being perceived in organizations and how it's changing. And then we put a summary of overall trends, professional trends that are taking place in the resilience industry. So that is the format of the report, which is been produced now for 5 consecutive years in a similar format, so it's becoming easier to actually make year-by-year comparisons. One very interesting way we deal with this information is we start at a very high level. We just ask not specific resilience risks or probabilities or impacts, but just actually say, within your region or your sector or your area of business, what are the sort of general risks that you consider to be the most important to you? Technological, political, economic, social, environmental. And we found that in every region of the world, technological risk came top. So then we move on to our annual predictions report. And the annual predictions report is a shorter report, and it gives us some opinion of things that we expect to happen in the coming year. We've headlined this year an outlook for a turbulent world, because we are feeling that 2020 is going to be quite turbulent. We think there are a lot of areas of the world that are in a very unstable situation, and this may lead to considerable pressures in a number of business areas. In fact, we made the conclusion at one part of the report that it was difficult to find many positives for the year ahead. But we also put the rider in, the world has a habit of surprising everyone. So it could be that though we think it's a turbulent year for 2020, maybe when we come to review it, there will be some positives. But at the moment, we are looking at the likelihood of things happening during 2020 based on the information we have at the moment. So the format for this report, quite simple. We provide 10 predictions for the year ahead, and we provide a review of the previous year's predictions to see how we did. And as you might expect, some of the predictions are very accurate, others are very wide of the mark. But we do think it's fair to say that most of the predictions will happen eventually. And this reminds me of the a statement from the famous writer George Orwell in the mid-30s, who said most forecasters get the direction correct, but usually expect things to happen much sooner than they do. And as he was famous for writing his book 1984, and it seems now that some of the things that he was predicting for 1984 are now starting to come to fruition, then maybe he was onto something with that. So I think we're fairly comfortable in saying that that some of the predictions that we make for 2020 may not occur in 2020 exactly, but we would expect them to happen in the not too distant future. So what are the areas that we're going to make predictions on? I'm not going to talk specifically in this section about the detailed prediction, but firstly, we're going to talk about the issues of cyber attacks. That's number one in our trends. report, so we're going to obviously make a forecast on that. We're also going to make forecasts about state-sponsored attacks on operational technology, which we think are clearly going to be a feature of the next few years. Extreme weather certainly seems to be with us and staying with us. Civil unrest, global political tensions are certainly increasing. Would there be a financial downturn? Maybe, maybe not, but we've made a forecast about that and the effect it may have on the resilience professions. China's increasing influence, activism and social media, power and water shortage, and legal challenges. These are the areas then that we're going to be making predictions for 2020 about. In the second part of my presentation, I'd like to talk about in more detail about the report and how we see resilience today and where it's going to. This is the full top 20 of our resilience index. And as you can see, and as I mentioned before in my earlier discussion, we have the top 5, which we've talked about. But if you actually look through the 20, you will see across that 20 things that you are very familiar with, the types of things that business continuity and resilience professionals have always had to deal with. There are pandemics, which had largely become of less significance within most of our index, but of course the recent events in China are likely to reopen that whole question of pandemic planning. There are whole questions of failure of critical national infrastructure. There is the possibility of failures due to regulatory inadequacies, which is causing organizations to actually fail. We have things such as terrorism, CBRN attacks, which are things that have typically been in our top 20. However, there are some new issues which we need to address, and these are starting to find their way up into that top 20. Just run through a few of these, which I think may be of interest because they're not typical of traditional business continuity activities. Firstly, the risks that we're going to get from social unrest and civil disturbances. We are seeing this particularly from the climate change debate, the extinction rebellion types of demonstrations around the world, and increased political demonstrations pretty much everywhere, not just in the normal places, but in places such as Hong Kong, Taiwan, places in Africa, as well as what we are seeing in the more developed parts of the world, where we're seeing increased protests. Secondly, workplace violence. Workplace violence has been particularly a problem in the United States, but we are now starting to see that in other places. Social media targeted attacks on organizations, fairly or unfairly, and how to respond to that. So the bringing together perhaps of traditional media crisis management and business continuity and operational crisis management to deal with targeted attacks is something that's becoming quite a big issue. We are starting now, of course, to see the results of the increased regulatory frameworks about misuse of private data, the heavy fines, the heavy penalties that can take place. This started with the legislation a couple of years ago in Europe. It's now moved to other domains such as California, where the fines for misuse of data can be quite prohibitive. We're seeing state-sponsored attacks much more than we saw now, and traditionally business continuity areas didn't really get involved in this. These were tended to be on government and at a high level of security dealing with this, but it's clearly now starting to be possible that we'll get operational technology attacks just on commercial organizations and not on governments. Regulatory compliance, a bit related to the heavy penalties, but perhaps wider than that, the chance related to this that people could lose their operating license simply as a failure to comply with the requirements. So these are issues, I think, which are starting to raise their heads and become more and more important to resilience managers. Let's move on now to emerging technology resilience issues. Well, we've dealt with cyber, we've dealt with disasters that are just part of the operational activities of technology, but there are so many new things that are starting to emerge, which are going to become commonplace in our lives. Artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, the use of cryptocurrencies, what's happening on the dark web, driverless automobiles, deepfake software. These are just 6 very quick items, bullet points that I've put up there. These are not all of the technology and emerging technology issues that we're going to have to wrestle with in the next few years. And so from a resilience point of view, we may have the consequences of these technologies being implemented in ways that are not necessarily as secure, as controlled as older technologies and more legacy technologies perhaps would have been. And the question I ask at this point is, are we as a society, and by that I mean government, business, academia, media, public, pretty much everyone, fully able to understand the risks these technologies bring to us? And are we mature enough to balance these against the benefits? Because it's very easy to say, oh, these are wonderful technologies, we go straight ahead. It's equally awkward to say these are all risky and very dangerous and we need to regulate them to a point where they may not be effective. So we need to get that balance between opportunity and risk. And are we mature enough to do that? Because I don't think we necessarily are. And if we aren't, as a society, we can expect that we can be facing a lot more crisis situations in future, and not just from the types of problems that we've traditionally linked in our top 20. So if you speak to most people about the issues that are probably facing the world, I guess there'd probably be 2 that would be at the top of many people's lists. One would be climate change issues, and the other would probably be technology. So if we look at climate change and where that is coming in the type of survey we're doing, we're seeing that issues that are almost certainly related in some way to climate change are manifesting itself very heavily in our survey. We're getting high scores for natural disasters, we're getting high scores for extreme weather, and these are being indirectly related to climate change. However, if we ask our resilience professionals about their role and how climate change affecting their direct role, then they're scoring quite low, in fact very low on our index, which means that essentially they are thinking about the short-term threats, the short-term things that are hitting them, not necessarily at this stage starting to put in place the longer-term measures to improve resilience as climate changes. This seems to be the pattern we're seeing. But I think we could also consider this may well be changing fairly quickly, because we're seeing so many high-profile announcements. Recently, Microsoft wants to become carbon negative, not even neutral by 2030, and some other more ambitious targets even than that. So this type of statement from major corporations is certainly going to put the changes that are going to have to happen to organizations very much at the front of the corporate agenda. And this will, of course, make many things more risky, many things more difficult to achieve. And I can only see that this is going to need a lot more planning to ensure that organizations continue to be resilient while they're making dramatic changes to the way they operate. This again, logically, if you look at all traditional fossil fuels for transportation, heating, and wherever else they are used, if these are going to be cut back dramatically in line with the corporate requirements, then we're going to be seeing a lot of business change, a lot of additional risk, and that's at the point where resilience management is its most important. And then, of course, one of the things fueling a lot of this is the public demonstration, the social media activism, which is targeting firms, creating reputational damage, giving firms the risk of non-compliance against regulations. So this whole issue of how the messages are being targeted on firms and how firms are going to be dealing with that are going to be, I think, key issues for resilience professionals in the next few years. So although if you ask a typical resilience professional today and say, how does climate change impact your day-to-day job, then they'll tend to focus on things like natural disasters, the extreme weather events. I think the wider issues are actually going to have a significant impact on our professionals in the very near future. So this brings me on to a related topic then of globalization. Globalization obviously is key to how we're going to deal with climate change. But then we start to look at how is globalization of the resilience profession working? Well, if we look at those key major risks that I discussed earlier and look at the major areas of the world, we'll see that technology is still everywhere considered the most risky aspect of the future. If you look beyond that, then there is some change, some differences between different regions, but not as much as you would see. Probably the most significant one, bearing in mind the comments about climate change, is that environmental risk and environmental issues from a resilience perspective seems to be of more concern and is stronger on the agenda at the moment than either North or Latin America. So it's more picked up in Europe and to some extent in Asia than it is in the Americas. So that I think is interesting, and at this stage it's an early finding, but I think it's something that we'll be looking at in future studies to see if there is a globalized approach to this, or whether one area or not is moving quicker than others in terms of dealing with some of these particular threats. So this brings me to the predictions report. I'm not going to give you, because we haven't time in this webinar, but if you would like to download the report, which we certainly hope you will, and read through it, it may give you some interesting pointers to some of these questions that I put here. It may also throw up lots of other questions which you may want to actually ask us about. We will have a session on this at the conference in Savannah in start of March. Those are going to be there. Please come along and join our debate and discussion. But some of the things we may be talking about there are, for example, ransomware. Now, ransomware and other cyber attacks, we've always reported it's going to be quite difficult to measure the extent of these. A lot of the measurements that are provided by experts in this field tend to be extrapolated from what they know and what they guess, because many firms have always kept these types of ransomware and some other attacks quiet. They've attempted to keep them secret, pay, and hope it goes away. Is this going to be relevant? Is it going to be possible in the future? It seems unlikely. Certainly the data breach laws and organizations that are suffering from data breaches and might pay up a ransom in the past will not, under any of the current legislation, be allowed to not report that. So once you actually start to have to report things, this may have two effects. It may appear in the figures that we get that this is on the increase. It may be that it's not on the increase, and it may simply be that we are just reporting more attacks. It may even be that it's on a decrease because it's perhaps less attractive to hold a company to ransom, knowing that as it's going to have to report it to the authorities, it may be less flexible in terms of paying and keeping quiet. So there are questions there, and this I think is going to be an interesting one to see how this is panning out. Certainly where state-sponsored cyber attacks might happen. Everyone is saying they will happen. It's no longer a discussion of they could happen. It's a simply an analysis of have they happened? Do we know about it? And if they haven't happened yet, where are they going to happen? And why? And who is going to cause the attacks? We've traditionally assumed that state-sponsored attacks would come from powers such as China and Russia. But it's quite reasonable to assume that other active states, particularly those with grievances against the United States or against the West in general, may well trigger these type of activities, and maybe through proxy states. So if, for example, Iran wants to take an action against the United States, would it do it from Iran or would it do it from somewhere else? These are the type of issues that are likely to be issues that are very much going to be in the resilience debate in the near future. Totally different and to some extent a question, but do floods and heat waves result in power and water shortages? Might seem a strange question, but the two trends we are seeing is the world is really showing much more flooding, worse flooding, and it's also showing worse heat waves. But as a result of heat waves, the world needs more power. Power is then causing shortages. Floods don't necessarily help with water shortages because they're never in the places that water is short. So we're getting a lot of drought. Are they related? Are they all part of some pattern? Is this all part of the climate change? Or is it simply specific requirements? Is it, for example, that we need to find a better way of generating more power? Are there other more clever technologies for dealing with water shortages? But do the current climatic trends lead to these? And that is, I think, is important in deciding how we can actually address the resilience issues. Political issues, plenty of those going on. And what is going to happen in the course of the next year, who knows? Relationships between the US and China, the US and the European Union, and my own country, the United Kingdom, will be leaving the European Union this year. We will, of course, see some changes there. But I think the big issues are really going to be happening in the Middle East and in that whole area of instability. These are the issues that are going to be affecting us, as well, of course, as the domestic political issues in the US with an election this year and the impeachment procedures against the president. So there's a lot of political issues that are going to have effects, and these may or may not directly impact the way that resilience professionals have to do their jobs. Can we take financial stability for granted? Or is it long expected crash going to happen? People have predicted the long crash similar to 2008 for some time. It hasn't happened. This in some ways is a year where you wouldn't expect it to, and the US economy is successful. Without a collapse in the US economy, it's unlikely there's going to be a global crisis, financial crisis. So on that basis, we can probably normally assume that there's not going to be a crash this year. But as I say before, there are many different issues happening that will make the world unstable. So this is certainly a possibility we have to bear against. And then activism. I think activism is a really big issue. Social media, activism in general. How will governments respond to it? How will businesses respond to it? Will it change policies? Will it change direction? And if it does, what is that actually going to do in terms of consistency of operational risks that we may face from having to change the way that we're operating? And who will make those decisions? How will that process happen? So I think this is going to be a very interesting area for the future, and things that we make some predictions about. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Our first speaker today is David Porter. And David Porter is the Australian representative on the Future Visions Committee. He lives in New South Wales. He works for the Australian government. As I'm sure you can guess, he's been extremely busy recently. Today he's going to share some of his experiences and his thoughts about extreme weather from the very personal perspective. And certainly in his presentation, he will be giving us a very, very graphical view of what he and his colleagues have been facing over the past few weeks. So I'd like to introduce then David Porter.
Hi everybody, my name's David Porter. I'm part of the DRI's Future Vision Committee. I'm one of the Australian representative for that group. I wanted to have a talk today, just a bit of an overview at the moment about the bushfire situation that's affecting the east coast primarily of Australia. I happen to live in that area, and today I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the size, the scale, and issues that are being faced by people in this region. My history is I used to run the ATO's business continuity management function, and the ATO being the Australian Taxation Office. I've moved from the day-to-day response running of the business continuity function more into a resilience function, particularly focusing on our people from a HR perspective. So my interest these days is particularly focused on the people aspects of disaster situations and the overall resilience approach that we would like to take. So on the screen in front of you is a snapshot from the Rural Fire Service of New South Wales. This is the app that they encourage everybody to have on their phones, particularly if you live in a bushfire-prone area. This view that you can see on the screen effectively covers the entire New South Wales region. Now, firefighting and emergency services across Australia are divided up into the respective states. The federal response is a layer above that. So being a New South Wales resident, all you can see here is the New South Wales fires that are indicated. Each diamond shape represents a fire, an individual fire, and those diamond shapes will change in colour from white when they are being reconciled through to blue, which is an advice level. Yellow being a level where you'd need to maybe watch and act a fire, it might be getting close to you, or red being an emergency. So this snapshot was taken a few days ago after the immediate response has died down a little bit. The conditions had eased across the fire ground. So on this particular view, all of the fires that are noted are at the blue level, which is just an advisory sort of level. You can see the distance from Brisbane up the top right-hand corner down to Albury represents, I guess, it probably takes about 2.5 hours or so to fly that distance. And looking at some comparative distances, it's the equivalent of Brisbane to Albury is the same as New York to Nashville, pretty much. So it's quite a large, expansive space. And you can see from this view that there are fires all up and down that eastern coast. Sydney has been spared in its metropolitan area, but pretty much all other regions up and down the coast have had fires. You'll see down towards Albury, which sits on the southern border, there are no fires listed beneath there. That's because it moves into the next state. And the state underneath New South Wales is Victoria. So they have a separate app, a separate view for those fires that have been also burning down there. So that area has extended, fire-affected area has extended beneath Albury. It's just not reflected on this particular view, which is one of the challenges that we face in Australia. From where there are fires close to borders, you can have multiple different agencies responding. We'll move to the next slide. This is a bit of a zoomed in view of the Sydney region. So you've got the interesting part here is that the fires have pretty much surrounded Sydney. The greyed blacked out areas are areas where the fire has already burnt. And you can see from the west of Sydney in this region up here, you have the Blue Mountains, very popular tourist destination, about a couple of hours drive outside of Sydney. You've also got the Southern Highlands just down here west of Wollongong. You have the Central Coast region, another very popular holiday spot to the north of Sydney. And then down along the southern coast, you have pretty much everywhere from Nowra and Shoalhaven all the way down to Bega and Bateman's Bay. This is a very, very popular holiday region. And then further down to the close to the Victorian border, I've got places like Bega, which is famous for our cheese. But once again, these areas are all very popular tourist destinations. They are all also reasonably active fire grounds. But what we've seen this time is the fires that have happened over the course of the last 6 weeks have all happened at the same time. Now, we're used to having fires in the Blue Mountains. We're used to having fires down on the south coast, but we're not used to having them all together all at the same time and in the extreme conditions that we've experienced. There is a very narrow band to get from Sydney down to Canberra. There's a main arterial road that pretty much leads you through the middle here. There's been plenty of times that road's been closed due to fire activity. And also along these coastal fringes, with closing the main road, the main access roads, you've had people that have been stranded out on the actual coast in the little holiday hamlets and things. The really key thing from this picture as well is that while Sydney itself hasn't been affected directly by fires, it's been significantly affected by the smoke from those fires around it. So for us, particularly during a holiday period over Christmas, it's been very difficult within Sydney to actually find some clear air. And what this basically means is that we've got automatic fire detection systems in buildings and shopping centres and movie theatres and things like that. But the smoke is just getting in everywhere to those. And for a period of time there, for about a week or so, we had a series of false alarms where the outside smoke was actually thick enough to trigger alarms on the insides of buildings. So we had a lot of building closures, a lot of building evacuations, and a lot of places were closed because we couldn't guarantee that the fire system would actually be able to identify a genuine fire within the building as well. So if we move to the next slide, this is zoomed in once again, shows Sydney up the top right-hand corner, down to Wollongong and into the top of the southern coast. Between these two fire grounds, you have Bowral in the middle, which sits on the main arterial road that goes between Sydney and Canberra. So it's a very fine line that's actually been kept open, and then that road will basically also link major transport routes down to Melbourne, down the bottom of the country. So it's very important for our country that we keep that transport corridor open, and there's been a lot of fire protection going on there. The little blue dot just down here is where I'm currently at. So I'm about 2.5 hours south of Sydney on the coast at the top of the Shoalhaven district area. We've got fires burning around us, but are thankfully quite safe where we are, and we have a couple of major river crossings before a fire would actually get anywhere near us. So we're quite okay at this point in time. And conditions have actually eased over the course of the last week or so. We've actually had some really good rainfall, and at the moment everything is pretty much smoke-free, and all of the fires that have been listed on the app have been listed as contained. So there's not very many major fires that are out of control at the moment, which is fantastic. So to get a bit of a view of what that's like, this is what my general daily view looks like. A little piece of paradise right on the beach, and a lovely place to be on the New South Wales south coast. We thoroughly recommend you come down and have a visit and a holiday if you're ever around. During the fires, you can see a bit of a comparison here between the normal view at the top and on one of the particularly bad fire days down the bottom at around, bottom photo was taken at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you can see that it's almost nighttime from the intensity of that thick black smoke coming towards us. And that fire is probably, as you could see on the map previously, was about 10 to 15 kilometres away from us at that time. This is a view from our surf club. This is just before the smoke came over us. It's quite a stark contrast with the white van and white building against a very, very dark black sky. Here's another view of the beach as well. You start seeing a few people coming down here. We have a very small community. We have a couple of corner stores and surf club and bowling club, and that's about it. But pretty much the whole community stopped, and everybody made their way down to the beach to see what was going on. It was quite apocalyptic. This is the view that greeted us for the few days afterwards as well. You can start to see some of the headland out towards in the distance there. But we lived with this smoky haze for a good week or so. So this is reflective of being sort of early afternoon, where it would normally be bright blue sky, beautiful white beach and blue water. But yeah, it was this very eerie, sort of cloudy, smoky, hazy kind of existence we had for a while. This is a view of a home of one of our, I guess, friends of an office worker sort of thing. There's all these photos floating around at the moment, but it shows you the sort of level of devastation that some of these communities have experienced. This photo was from a house fairly close to the middle of the main fire down on the New South Wales south coast, down towards Ulladulla. And to go from the top picture to the bottom picture takes all of about 15 minutes. The intensity of the fire, nothing much really stands in its way, except ironically the little gatepost with the welcome sign on it seems to have somehow stayed there. But pretty much everything else is consumed by these fires. There aren't very many structures around that can actually withstand the intensity of them. And we actually have a lot of buildings having sprinklers fitted to the outside of them to try and stop some of the embers from lighting fires on the roofs and the nearby surrounds. So it's really, really awful stuff. Huge devastation across the community, and it's going to be a really tricky thing to rebuild from, not just from the physical side of things, but I guess the emotional side of things. Everybody's well-being has kind of been rattled, but we're a resilient bunch, and there's a lot of effort and a lot of fundraising and a lot of help all kind of coming together. And that's part of the Australian spirit, is we all kind of pitch in and help each other out. So we're in a bit of a bad state at the moment, but there's certainly in time we will bounce back. This last picture is actually a picture just taken recently of some of the regeneration that's already started to happen across some of the fire grounds. This one is from further up north, and after some rainfall, the Australian bush is very quick to start regenerating itself. So this is a really nice view of amongst the charred trees and things. There's a little bit of new life starting to come along. And some of our bush actually needs fires to be able to regenerate properly. But like I said, it was just unprecedented in terms of its size and everything burning at once this time round. This page just lists a few of the issues that we probably need to be looking through. First and foremost, like I said, the size of things, the scale of this of these fires have just been humongous. They've dwarfed the Amazon fires by a huge margin. We've had a lot of lives lost, I think in the low 20s, and importantly and tragically included some of the volunteer firefighters as well, which has just been heartbreaking to see. We have lost more lives previously in other disasters, but we, through some of the advanced alert warning systems and some of the huge efforts by water bombing aircraft and volunteers. I think that's probably saved many more lives from being lost as well. We had a huge loss of wildlife. It's been well documented, and particularly there are certain areas that are unique to different variants of different species. So koala population on Kangaroo Island, for example, will have slightly unique characteristics to others found elsewhere, and has been just an incalculable loss of wildlife that I think we'll never really actually get a handle on, to be honest. Long-term economic impacts are going to be felt across the regions, particularly some of these areas that have been burnt are holiday regions that rely on seasonal income, and there's a huge ripple effect for communities and I guess other services that rely on having a population that grows significantly over the December-January period and then shrinks throughout the rest of the year. So there'll be a lot of long-term economic issues that will need to be worked through there. Federal versus state-based activations, like I mentioned at the beginning, emergency services are the responsibility of states, and there's been some difficulties over where federal response efforts from the Defence Force and the Army and the Navy, etc., how they would play through into here. So I think there's some questions there for us on how the activations work more seamlessly across federal and state-based areas. And the last one was the smoke and air impacts in non-fire areas. Now that was something that we felt particularly this time. You had vast areas of Sydney that were very safe from fire. There had no fire threat whatsoever, but the respiratory issues that people were presenting with spiked quite significantly, and there was simply just no fresh air to try and get to. So we had people holed up in sealed office buildings and as much as they could, but it was a very tricky health situation to manage there. So there could be an argument to look at different options for different types of safe havens, for example, in particular areas. So that'll be interesting as well. But overall, it's been a really worrying time and a very stressful time for our communities. But like I mentioned before, we are very resilient, and rebuilding efforts are already underway. And we are looking forward to welcoming, particularly into our tourist areas, people back into those areas to help boost the economy. It's safe to do so, and it's a wonderful place to come and visit. So we are looking forward to welcoming people back as soon as possible. So look, that's a very quick run through of the situation. There's certainly lots of coverage out there. If you're interested in understanding more about it, probably the best source within Australia is the ABC News website, and they have a series of blogs in there that are also available to understand various aspects of the situation and the response. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and have a wonderful day. Cheers.
Thanks, David, for finding the time to join us today. It must have been a pretty hectic period for you over the last few weeks. Now we're going to hear from Boris. Boris Asabi is the Director of Business Continuity for Gilead Sciences, where he oversees the corporate resilience governance and operation across the whole organization's global footprint. He manages all phases of planning, analysis, and implementation of the recovery solutions in direct support of the resilience and crisis management objectives. Boris has a long experience in all aspects of technology, and I'm sure that he'll be able to share much of his experience with us today. Welcome, Boris.
Hello and welcome to this webinar on technology, risk and resilience. My name is Boris Issavi, and I will be going through the technology portion of the annual trends report published by the Future Vision Committee. A little bit about myself and the organizations I have been involved with in my professional career. I'm sure many of you recognize most of, if not all of the organizations listed here. I've been involved with some of these organizations more than the others, but always in the business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis management capacity. I've been in this field for over 15 years, actually 20 plus years in risk management, and 15 specifically dedicated to business continuity and crisis management. In my current role at Gilead, I direct the business continuity management program, where I oversee the corporate resilience governance and operations. We have a global footprint, so everything falls within my jurisdiction, and this includes all phases of planning, analysis, and implementation of recovery solutions for our risk appetite. My full bio obviously is on LinkedIn. You can simply search by my first and last name, Boris Issavi, and you will have access to the entire bio. So from the technology and resilience perspective, in the 5 years since the Trends report was introduced, this has evolved to identify some new issues and others which have only recently become of significant concern to professionals. Overall, the main risks have always concentrated on technological failure and large-scale natural disaster. In today's session, we will be focusing on those IT-related resilience risks. What we have discovered is that of the 20 resilience indexes, actually, let me go to the next slide. This will explain it better. In 2019, the risks posed by technology attack or failure have further consolidated their positions at the top of the resilience register. Top two on this year's index, both overall and in every region and nearly all business sectors, is the concern of a successful major cyber attack and data breach, which for the sake of this report include any kind of malware, ransomware, denial of service, you name it, man in the middle types of attacks, or any other form of attacks. In third position this year was the risk of accidental IT outage, which, although not intentional like the first two, but it's still nevertheless devastating in its impact. Looking at the list of top 20 resilience risks, as you can see on the screen, you will notice 5 that are directly technology related. Those are the ones marked in red. But as you glance quickly at the other indices, I'm sure you would agree that the impact of each one of the others would also be amplified without a resilient technology infrastructure. So pretty much technology has its hand in many, if not all of these indices that are listed here for 2020. One interesting point this year, the issue of misuse of private data, number one on the list, and the consequences of this happening has been reflected in the resilience index and is likely to increase further in future years. This is clearly connected to the issue of data breach and concerns that many of our survey takers had, which obviously are warranted. If we peel off the first layer of technology risk and go one level deeper, we notice that as our resilience and dependence on technology has grown, so has the risk posed by the same technologies. I think we all would agree that in coming years, these risks will only increase as our dependence increases and new cases are developed. Some of the areas to watch for, we have listed them here. Of course, this is not an exhaustive list. This only comes based on the survey results that we have received. But at the top of the list is artificial intelligence. And under this category, we are also including deep learning and machine learning. Next is robotics, any mechanical device that increases human abilities is listed under that category. Internet of Things, as now my toaster and refrigerator can autonomously communicate with one another and with my handheld device. Cryptocurrencies, and also under that category, we are including blockchain technology. Number 5 is fraud and other crime using the dark web, as more bad actors are becoming increasingly active in this space. And also deep fakes, the technology that recreates reality to the point that it's very difficult to distinguish what's real and what is not. As we look at the survey results across all regions and almost all sectors, technology risk is seen as the most important of the macro global risks. Interestingly, putting it ahead of economic, social, environmental, and political considerations as well. Clearly, the resilience profession is now much closer to information than physical security. Before I go through this slide, let me just remind everyone that this year's report, similar to the previous 4 years, was based on the survey conducted by the Future Vision Committee. DRI took the survey results and categorized them into 21 sectors. Interestingly, 12 of those 21 ranked technology as their main risk. But there were also certain sectors or subsectors that rose to the top as far as their technology risk and the impact that a technology failure would have on them, on their business, and also their governmental agencies, financial services, general business services. Those were the consulting agencies, auditors, tech and telecoms, the telecommunication industry. Many of the governmental agencies rose to the top here, and also healthcare. In each of these sectors, again, the top 2 specific risks were major cyber attack and severe data breach. Understanding that there are a lot of overlapping between those specific risks. A cyber attack most of the times involves data breach, but not always. Same with severe data breach. It could or could not be through a cyber attack. Interesting point about since the full report was published, I'm sure many of you have seen Travelex showing up in the news, the worldwide currency exchange. You've seen them in many of the major airports and big cities around the world. They were held to ransom in December of 2019, although the hackers claim that the breach actually started back in July of 2019, which amplifies the potential impact. Unfortunately, there hasn't been a whole lot coming out of Travelex on the details of how much was breached and how many people were impacted. But what we have gathered from the news is that they were held for $6 million, and I personally have not seen any report on whether or not Travelex paid the ransom and if the data was recovered. However, it is likely that well-publicized cases have demonstrated the surprising high cost of remediation following a cyber attack. And that is from mostly from the regulators. In the case of data breach, the successful prosecution of companies such as British Airways and Marriott Group have led to unprecedented and unexpected financial penalties. As you are all aware, in 2019, UK fined British Airways for 200 million and Marriott Group for 120 million. In both cases, their data breaches were much less significant than that of Travelex. The regulators have made it clear that there are no mitigating circumstances, even if the companies reported the breach in a timely manner and cooperated with the authorities and met all the requirements. At the end, they were held responsible. As all major companies and government agencies, I'm sure yours included, are increasing their spend on safeguarding their data, we are seeing the role of business continuity professionals morphing and becoming more blended with technology, which is a trend that will continue in 2020 as well. That pretty much wraps up the technology portion of this year's trending report. I just want to remind you to log into DRI site and access the full annual DRI predictions report under resources. And again, you will have the option of downloading the report in PDF format and reference it throughout the year. And with that said, I would like to thank you for participating in this webinar. Again, my name is Boris Issavi, wishing you a healthy 2020 until we meet again. Thank you.
That's all the time we have for today. Thanks again to our speakers. We invite you to join us at DRI 2020 in Savannah, Georgia for a special session with Lyndon Bird, answering your questions about what 2020 has in store. In this highly interactive session, you'll have the opportunity to vote on a number of the key issues and see the results in real time. Come ready to discuss and debate the issues that will affect us all in the coming year and beyond. If you still have questions that we didn't cover, give us a call at 866-542-3744. A recording of this and all our other webinars is posted on the DRI website. This webinar has been a production of DRI International 2020, all rights reserved. Thank you for your attention.